Wir können starten.
Dear Professor Cuffel, dear participants of the lecture series, Ambivalent Neighborhoods, dear students, dear colleagues, warm welcome also to those watching via YouTube. A warm welcome tonight to this final lecture in our lecture series devoted to the religious, cultural, social, and political dynamics between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in different historical constellations. Let me start by thanking everybody in the audience for continuing to contribute and to discuss the lectures that we have heard in the past few months during this winter term. Thank you for staying with us all the time. And many thanks, Professor Cuffel, for agreeing to take over this final lecture and to talk to us tonight. I'm delighted that we have you as a guest speaker today. A few introductory words, first to the topic. During the last few months, we have explored a number of different facets of the metaphor of ambivalent neighborhoods. We have discussed conceptual questions regarding the triangle of the three monotheistic or Abrahamic religions, and we have seen that there's a considerable debate even about the very terms we are using when we are using monotheism or Abrahamic traditions. We have then discussed a broad variety of case studies devoted, for instance, to questions regarding philosophical and theological encounters in different periods. We have devoted much attention to different urban contexts in different time periods and regions in Europe, the Ottoman Empire, the Near and Far East, with different constellations of neighboring religions and power relations, be it Jewish-Christian, Jewish-Muslim, or Jewish-Christian and Muslim. We have seen the relevance of religious, social, economic, political, and legal dimensions of such neighborhoods, which were to different degrees characterized by elements of ambiguity. We have touched on the fact that looking at how living together in close proximity may change what we seem to know about potential affinities, differences, or conflicts between the different religions and communities. But what we have not yet discussed in more detail is the phenomenon Alexandra Cuffel will focus on today, with an emphasis on the Mediterranean during the medieval period, namely the sharing of contested places, rituals, customs, and even saints by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities. And to my mind, this is an essential and most welcome addition to what we have learned so far. And I'm delighted that we will have the opportunity to discuss this with you. Please let me briefly introduce our speaker. Alexandra Cuffel is Professor of Jewish Religion in past and present times at the Center for Religious Studies at Ruhr-Universität Bochum. She is a scholar of medieval history who received her training in Bloomington, Indiana at Cambridge University and at New York University, where she did her PhD in 2002. She has worked at different places then in the US, Virginia, then also at the University of Massachusetts and other places. And before coming to Bochum, first as a visiting research scholar of the Goethe-Hamburger Kolleg, Dynamiken der Religionsgeschichte, and later on a permanent basis, she has been adjunct professor of history at the College of New Jersey and adjunct assistant professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. In recent years, she was actually the director of this already mentioned Goethe-Hamburger Kolleg, Dynamics of Religion, and a member of the directorial board of the center that grew out of this project, the Center for Religious Studies, a very impressive major center in religious studies in Germany. She leads a fascinating research project entitled Jews East, funded by the EU, an ERC Consolidator grant, which analyzes the encounter between Jews and Christians outside of Europe and outside of the Byzantine area, and looks for the under-researched question of how the Oriental Orthodox churches and Jews relate to each other. Professor Cuffel's research focuses on relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims during the Middle Ages, specifically on the intersections of religious polemics, medieval theories, and gender, both in Western Europe and the Middle East. And we're going to profit tonight from a project that she is about to finish, a book project, which is devoted to shared saints and festivals among Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the medieval Mediterranean. I would like to mention at least two publications, namely the monograph Gendering Disgust in Medieval Religious Polemic that was published in 2007, and an edited volume entitled Religion, Gender, and Culture in the Pre-Modern World, also 2007. But the title tonight is Festival Saints and Contested Sharing among Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the medieval Mediterranean. We are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Okay, let me share my screen. So thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Okay, from the beginning. All right, hopefully we will all have a good time this evening. The Book of the Necessity of the Upright Path Against the Friends of Hell is perhaps the longest and most numerous tirades against Muslims praying at grave sites, joining in or imitating Jewish or Christian festivals that the 14th century legal scholar from Syria, Ibn Taymiyyah, wrote. He asserted, thus, participation with them, namely non-Muslims, in their festivals, wholly or partly, is synonymous with participation with them in unbelief, wholly or partly. Nay, festivals are that which most particularly serves to differentiate one religious law from another and constitute their most prominent symbols. He gave weight to the meaning of festivals and their role in symbolically distinguishing one religion from another. Let us suppose that he did not lest one suppose that he did not understand that many people merely sought to have a good time rather than enact an entire belief system. Ibn Taymiyyah further explained. But lavish indulgence in customs of food, clothing, sport, and recreation is simply a corollary of the religious festival, just as it is a corollary of an Islamic festival. The innovators change everyday conditions or part of them by preparing special food, by display of finery and garb, or by incurring additional expenditure, etc., without, however, attaching any religious significance to these newfangled customs. This, of course, is most abominable and of gravest religious consequence, and so is the conformity with the God-displeasing ones. A more adamant party pooper, Spaßbremse, as one might say in German, one was not likely to find. Many of his co-religionists also found him too strict or obnoxious, so much so that he was eventually imprisoned. Yet his remarks here highlight an important issue for understanding what appear to be shared festivals, namely that the perceptions or motivations of those coming from an external religious community to the festival or holy site of another group were not necessarily the same as those of the community who considered the site or festival theirs. Put in simpler, more concrete terms, while some Muslims, in this case, may have understood attending Christmas or Easter celebrations of the Christians or Purim celebrations of the Jews as just having fun or going to a good party with their non-Muslim neighbors, that was not necessarily how Christians or Jews perceived such behavior. Not even all Muslims saw such interreligious merrymaking as devoid of religious significance. Ibn Taymiyyah certainly did not. So what I would like to examine with you today is twofold. One, the reactions of members of various Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities, for it is important to keep in mind that there was a plurality within each of these broad designations. To members of different outside religious groups, venerating holy people or being present at or participating in festivals, which these Jewish, Christian, or Muslim communities consider to be theirs. And two, reactions of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim community to one of their own members attending the religious celebrations of another group. I will demonstrate that the portrayal of shared practice varied according to the cultural, geographic, as well as religious origin of the authors, the degree of power the author, i.e., did he belong to the politically dominant religious community of his or her homeland, and according to the cultural, geographic, and political setting of the actual shared religious festival. In all permutations, the discourse about shared festivals or holy sites and people relate back to demonstrations of religious and sometimes political hierarchy and truth. This observation accords with those made by many recent anthropologists and historians who have examined such behaviors. Now, before going directly to the historical material I wish to present to you today, I thought it might be helpful for those of you who do not have a background in religious studies or anthropology to indicate some, though not all, of the main theorists who have dealt with festivals and or shared practices. As you see, it is not merely anthropologists, sorry about that, it is not merely anthropologists who have attempted to formulate theories about such phenomena, but historians and literary theorists as well. What is most useful for my own work are the first two types of communitas, namely instances of spontaneous abandonment of daily restraints and hierarchies, which for Victor and Edith Turner were the social structures which governed everyday life and interactions, and so-called normative communitas. This last concept helps to think about instances of governmental or religious authority co-opting festivals, which in other circumstances they had opposed, but more on that later. The Turners were not the first to posit that festivals, or specifically Carnival, created their own laws in time and space. Here, the theories of Michael Bakhtin and Johann Huizinga are especially relevant when thinking about why rivalries between communities sometimes seem to be set aside during festivals, or at the very least, change in the nature of their expression. For all of these thinkers, the normal rules are suspended during the period of play or special ritual. The Marxist historian Christopher Hill built upon some of the ideas of Bakhtin in his examination of Carnival in Europe, and he emphasized the subversive nature of festivals. This concept of the function of Carnival has been applied to large-scale festivals, such as Nowruz, which in Egypt was transformed from the celebration of the Persian Zoroastrian New Year to a celebration of the Nile. Now, most subsequent anthropologists have sought to refine or counter what many saw as Turner's oversimplistic or optimistic understanding of pilgrimage or other festivals, especially when members of more than one community were involved. Eden Celano argued that pilgrimage was not just about the reinforcement or suspension of social norms. Rather, it was about the different discourses and when multiple communities were involved, competing discourses over the same site or holy person. According to their research and that of other anthropologists who contribute to their volume, sometimes even people and even sometimes the same individual could have multiple reasons for engaging in pilgrimage, and I would add other types of festivals. Without examining the multiplicity of discourses about a particular pilgrimage site or festival, according to them, we as scholars cannot possibly understand the nature of interreligious encounter which takes place at such events. That said, through interreligious interactions and discourses are my main focus, they are not the only ones which are relevant. Social, gendered, or political discourses are also powerful elements, And all of these, of course, are intertwined with religious ones. In many ways, Haydn is very similar to Ida and Celano. However, he is especially focused on the role of religious dominance and violence which ensues when claims to dominance are threatened. Particularly useful is his insistence on attention to changing circumstances, laws, behaviors, geographies, ownership, etc., over time, and the relevance of older discourses to understanding any given period or phenomenon under study. This point, from a historian's perspective, is too often forgotten by anthropological analyses. Yet because of his emphasis on dominance and violence, he ignores other aspects of shared practices, including often a detailed analysis of the perspective of those not in power. Thus, his observations are relevant for only a portion of the shared sites and festivals and discourses attached to them by Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the medieval and early modern Mediterranean. Speaking of historians, we now come to Kadar and Brehan. Benjamin Kadar developed his categorization of convergence when examining evidence of Muslim as well as Christian pilgrimage to the Marian icon at Saidnaya, located in Syria. He found that many of the so-called shared pilgrimages fell into the category he dubbed convergence, which he contended involved a common recognition by multiple groups that a place was holy, but not participation in a single shared religious ritual. According to him, categories 1 and 2, convergence and unequal convergence, are far more common than the last one, equal convergence, certainly for the medieval sources he studied. Note that his unequal convergence bears marked similarities to Turner's normative communitas and to the observations of Ida and Salano and Haydn about the roles of competition and power when a holy site is revered by multiple religious communities. In the course of my own examination, I would add a fourth category to Kadar's formulation, namely forced convergence or sharing, which, while extant in both Islamicate lands, i.e. lands ruled by Muslims, and Latin Europe, Western Europe ruled by Catholic Christians in the Middle Ages, was particularly prevalent in medieval Iberia and parts of what is now Italy. James Graham is less interested in competition between groups than understanding why there are shared holy sites in the first place, and why are such places often feature caves, water sources, or trees, such as this wishing tree in modern-day Turkey. He suggests that there is a kind of agricultural religion of necessity that exists along official confessions, such as the various forms of Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. While leaders of confessional religions, if they choose to incorporate such places and practices rather than fighting, usually unsuccessfully, to abolish them, may create theologies or stories to appropriate them into the doctrine and religious perspective of a given author. Nevertheless, such places continue to attract participants from multiple communities. This is because their function supersedes and often chronologically precedes those of any one official religion. Evidence of the veneration of sacred trees, water sources, or caves spans much of Central and West Asia, Europe in the early Middle Ages, and continuing to this day in certain regions, with striking similarity in practice, which would seem to support Graham's thesis. Yet I would argue that in addition to the long-standing customs based on life cycle need, such as agricultural or human fertility and health, the ways in which shared or similar symbols and the rituals associated with them may serve as a common language between religious communities. Having mutually comprehensible set of symbols encouraged Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Mediterranean to join one another's festivals and to recognize one another's holy buildings and people. Excuse me. Christians and Muslims in the Mediterranean had to join one another's festivals and recognize one another's holy buildings and people. In the Mediterranean, both living and dead. Regarding trees, water sources, and caves, Jews, Christians, and Muslims appropriated such locale by associating them with the burial place or some other aspect of the holy life of an individual, despite clear awareness on the part of some religious leaders, Ibn Taymiyyah among them, not surprisingly perhaps, that these places and practices surrounding them had their origins in earlier polytheistic religions. Sweet or foul smell had long been indicators of holiness or evil, respectively, in ancient Greek culture, and then in late antique Jewish and Christian, eventually Muslim culture. Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike envisioned heaven as a fragrant garden filled with scents of fruit, incense, and spices. Late antique Jewish mystics considered ritual pollution and anything, including foods normally permitted by Jewish law, which made the body produce unpleasant smells, as a barrier to ascending the heavenly realms, whereas Muslims imagined that inhabitants of paradise were free of bodily pollution or bodily elimination. From late antiquity through the early modern period in the Mediterranean regions, but also in Northern Europe, the corpses of prophets, rabbis, saints, and martyrs were regularly portrayed as odorless or more frequently as emitting pleasant fragrance, whereas heretics, sinners, or the religiously insincere rotted quickly and stank. For example, according to one Jewish text from the 12th or 13th century from Northern Europe, a righteous man who had been buried next to a wicked one appears to everyone in the town in a dream and complains that he cannot rest for the stench of his neighbor, which is like that of a latrine. To pacify him, the townspeople place a barrier between his grave and that of his wicked neighbor. Yet such olfactory markers were not merely for the dead. They also signaled holiness for the living. For example, the Andalusian Sufi, that is a Muslim mystic, Ibn al-Arabi, said that the tears of one of his teachers, Abu Ahmed al-Salawi, smelled like musk, and that he used to wipe his face with those that al-Salawi had shed upon the ground. People encountering Ibn Arabi would ask him where he had purchased such a wonderful scent. Likewise, light was also a shared symbol of holiness. The graves of the wicked in hell were characterized by darkness in contrast to the illumination emitted from the tombs of the righteous. As Joseph Mary and other scholars have indicated, medieval Jews, Christians, and Muslims all took steps to artificially ensure that holy places and graves were characterized by lovely aromas and light. In doing so, however, they were all using the same indicators of sanctity, so that a member from any one of these communities could step into a shrine, regardless of whose or what kind, and immediately recognize that it was intended as a hallowed place. Such recognition, I would argue, frequently emboldened visitors to treat such sites accordingly, whether or not that place belonged to their community. The fact that Jews and Muslims both believed that the punishment or reward of the afterlife of a deceased person began in the grave, and that the dead retained a close connection to their body, a view shared to a lesser extent by Christians, various Christian communities of the Eastern Mediterranean, further encouraged Jews, Christians, and Muslims of various sorts to treat graves of holy people as sites of blessing and intercession, even when religious authorities protested against asking the dead directly for assistance. The tomb of the Virgin Mary was one such place, revered and visited by Christians and Muslims alike during the Middle Ages. Much as one may imagine from the descriptions of the distant past, the tomb is now filled but with the light of many lamps, supplemented by what pilgrims themselves bring. Mary was one of many figures who appeared in the scriptures of two or more communities, in this case, Muslim and Christian. Abraham and the other patriarchs and matriarchs said to be buried in Hebron or Al-Khalil were another set, revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Having a shared tradition of sanctity for particular figures certainly set the stage for joint pilgrimage sites. This was not the only criteria, however. Narratives about Christians and Muslims seeking the help at the graves of Talmudic rabbis or Jews and Christians turning to living Muslim holy men or women also abound, along with accounts of disputes over religious affiliation of unidentified holy people whose graves had become the focus of pilgrimage. Having outlined the shared symbolic elements which may have facilitated shared veneration and some of the main theories about the nature of such sharing, I finally turn to the sources themselves, beginning with Jewish and Christian pilgrims from Europe to the Middle East. For both of these groups, the presence and seeming veneration of the religious other was an affirmation of what they understood to be the truth. Some mentioned the presence of Muslims at the tombs or other sites which the author, whether Jewish or Christian, deemed holy without expressing approval or disapproval. Nevertheless, the mere fact that Muslim veneration of biblical prophets, rabbis, or extra-biblical Christian saints is described without objection implies tacit acceptance of their presence at these graves by Jewish or Christian authors. While some may have contented themselves with noting that the presence of others at the grave sites and festivals, others were far less neutral. For Rabbi Samuel ben Samson, traveling in 1210 CE, Muslim attendance at Jewish saints' graves brought honor to one Jonathan ben Uziel, who was a rabbi from the early Tannitic period, that is 20 to 40 CE. We found there the sepulchre of Jonathan, son of Uziel, on which there is a great tree. The Ishmaelites bring oil to it and have a light burning there in his honor. They make their vows there too, to his glory. Concerning the grave of another rabbi from the same era, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horonicus, Samuel also noted that the Ishmaelites, many Muslims, bring oil to burn there. It is a great and marvelous wonder. The attribution of glory to Jonathan because Muslims bring light and make their vows to him, or Samuel's wonder because Muslims come with gifts of oil to Rabbi Eliezer's grave, strongly indicates that for Rabbi Samuel, the presence of Muslims enhanced the status of Jewish saints, and Muslims' attendance was clearly a positive event. Western Christian pilgrims frequently commented about Muslim veneration of Mary, mother of Jesus, and portray Mary as assisting Muslims who revere her, much to the delight of Christians who reported these events. For example, the Christian pilgrim Simon Simeonus from the 14th century reported, at times the Saracens, Muslim, devoutly holding vigil, all the time occupy themselves in the praises of the glorious Virgin. They wash and bathe themselves and their sick beside the fountain in a convenient place set aside for that purpose, where many protections are granted by the merits of the Virgin, sometimes even appearing personally to the Saracens, as the guards told us on oath, who with their own eyes saw her numberless times, walking around the fountain, to whom be glory and honor, world without end. Here the Muslims' praise of and petition to the Virgin Mary and her willingness to help them very clearly augments the wonders of the Virgin in Simon's eye. That she appears to Muslims regularly further increases the impression that Muslims have been added to Mary's community, though, as with the Jewish text, there is no question of their conversion. Not all authors were so even-handed. The Christian friar Felix Fabry created a hierarchy in his description of shared practices. On the right side of the church is a large, deep cistern resembling a vast sepulchre filled with water and covered by lattice work. It is said that Joseph drew water from it for his most saintly family to use, for the washing of the child Jesus, for cooking and for drinking, and by such use of this water attained virtue, so that to this day it is the most healthful and cures many ailments. Therefore, as many Christians as Saracens also often gather this water for the care of certain illnesses. What is more, the Saracens take their children to this place in order to be baptized in this water with the baptism of Christ, not that they believe in the spiritual effect of baptism, rather they seek only corporeal salvation and health. Both Felix Fabri and Simon Simeonis indicated that Christians and Muslims sought out the well for prophylactic or curative purposes. Unlike Simon Simeonis, however, who saw the attendance and healing of Muslims and Christians together as glorifying Mary, Felix depicted the Muslims' motives negatively. He sought to create both division and clear hierarchy between the two groups by indicating that Muslims desired baptism only for corporeal health. Within this remark is an implied contrast to the Christians, whose motives for baptism are presumably spiritual, thus placing the Christians on a higher and more correct plane in the divine realm rather than the Muslims. Felix's inference is troubled, however, by his admission that both groups came to the water source to gain healing. His effort to impose Christian over Muslim in the face of shared ritual without according Muslims a place within the communitas of Mary becomes contradictory, thinly masking the unified purpose of all the participants. So far, the examples of shared veneration or participation that I have provided have been voluntary ones. Frequently, the religious other was compelled to observe certain rituals, at least according to the narrative accounts of European Jews and Christians. In some instances, the pressure was fairly benign, though it was always seen as miraculous. At other times, the encounter between the holy dead and the religious other was far less friendly. Muslims who failed to respect the sacred space dedicated to Jewish prophets and sages found themselves thwarted. For example, according to the Italian Jewish traveler Meshulam of Volterra, every time the Muslims attempted to steal the stone over Rabbi Eliezer ben Arak's grave, the dead rabbi simply brought it back to its place the following morning. The Mishnaic Rabbi Meir was less forbearing about such pilfering. In the narrative describing these travels of Pataki of Regensburg, who was from the 12th to the early 13th century, a Muslim sultan unwisely removed the stone step leading to the grave of the rabbi. As a result, in the night, Rabbi Meir came to him in a dream and seized him by the throat and wanted to strangle him. And Rabbi Meir said to him, "Why did you steal my stone? For don't you know that I am a tzaddik and beloved of God?" Then he sought his pardon. He said, "No, I won't do it till you carry the stone back yourself on your shoulder before the eyes of all. And you say, I was wicked and I stole from my Lord the tzaddik." The next day he carried the stone on his shoulder before the eyes of all. He returned it to its place and he said, "I was wicked and I stole from my Lord the tzaddik." The Muslims fear him and they prostrate themselves there on his grave and they give him gifts and vow if they return in peace to give him such and such. Here, the leader of the Muslims is publicly humiliated by the dead rabbi and forced to restore the building to the holy to the Jews. Indeed, elsewhere in the narrative, the author indicates that the Muslims transform it into a beautiful structure out of fear of Rabbi Meir's wrath. Such restoration would have been especially significant since one of the marks of subjugation of the dhimmi, the term for the people of the book, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, subjugated under Muslim rule, was that they were prohibited from constructing new synagogues, churches, or other religious buildings, or repairing those that they had. In this tale, the Sultan himself is compelled to rectify one of the symbols of Jewish subservience dictated by Muslim law. Muslims' veneration of the holy man enhances the individual status of the saint, or tzaddik as it's called, even as it did for Jonathan ben Uziel and Eliezer ben Hieronychus in Rabbi Simon's narrative. However, the author of this story and others like it took a step further and portrayed the Jewish holy dead as more powerful than the Muslims, thus glorifying not only the saint, but Judaism as a whole. The saint's ability to press the Sultan and other Muslims into honoring him is a direct reversal of living Jews' social and political relations with non-Jews. The holy Jewish dead are able to do what the living could not, force the non-Jews in power over them to offer respect and even obedience. These rhetorical acts of resistance assured audiences that the correct spiritual hierarchy, namely Jewish over Muslim, was indeed in place and re-emphasized the validity of Judaism. What is striking about these tales is that the Jewish holy dead desire and expect Muslim veneration. In Christian pilgrimage accounts and collections of miracle tales from Iberia, France, and other parts of Northern Europe, the Virgin Mary regularly punishes Muslims who do not honor her appropriately and thereby compels them to venerate her. Those who remain obstinate die. Other Christian saints, such as St. George, St. Barbara, St. James, St. Isidore, among others, are sometimes, though not always, less absolute in their punishment of disrespectful Muslims, but are no less capable of enforcing their will upon them, according to medieval and early modern authors. As for the Jewish examples discussed earlier, such accounts depicted the Christian holy dead as being able to do what living Christians could not do in Muslim-controlled lands, namely enforce Muslim and respect and obedience for Christian holy symbols. Now, you may have noticed so far that I have provided only examples of European Jews and Christians describing Muslim presence at holy sites, and Jews and Christians that they considered theirs. European Jews and Christians did not often include descriptions of one another participating in festivals or making pilgrimage. European Jews noted the existence of Eastern Christians and their relationship both with one another and with Jews, while European Christians noted the existence and social religious status of local Jews and Samaritans. Often these remarks were fairly brief. More detailed and also more venomous in tone are Jewish accounts of Western Christians, particularly Crusaders. For example, the narrator of Pataki Regenberg's journey contrasts Muslims and Crusaders by claiming that the king of the Ishmaelites, a friend of the Jews, had constructed a beautiful place of prayer where the temple and court had once stood and commanded that only Jews worship there. These actions are contrasted in the narrative with the Gentiles, Goyim, meaning in this case the Crusaders, who attempt to place images in the building. In this story, Muslims, at the very least, respect Jewish holy space, even if they do not actively venerate it themselves, whereas Christians attempt to reshape the space according to their own beliefs. In a briefer description, but seemingly of the same place and phenomena, Rabbi Amiel ben Samson says that the Muslims do indeed venerate this place. In both narratives, the images fall down each time Christians attempt to set them up, indicating God's defense of holy space and utter rejection of Christian claims. Muslims, however, occupy a liminal space between the rejected Christians and the holy Jews, being neither part of the Jewish community, yet nor repudiated out of hand as their enemy or unaware or disrespectful of Jewish knowledge and sanctified space. This story more explicitly indicates the hierarchy that most Western Jewish pilgrimage accounts imply by lauding the presence of Muslims at holy sites or festivals and ignoring the Christians. In other narratives, Christians are punished by the Jewish holy dead, but unlike such tales featuring Muslims, Often Christians, especially crusaders, are killed in the encounter. European Christian travelers also created hierarchies between between different kinds of non-Christians, not just Christian versus non-Christian. Felix Fabry, for example, uses smell and access to baths and holy spaces to create a hierarchy with Christians on top, of course, then Muslims, thereafter Jews, and at the very bottom, Samaritans. Late medieval and early modern Christian pilgrims to the Middle East took a story that had long circulated in Europe, in which the Virgin Mary helps a Jewish woman who is having trouble giving birth. In 12th and 13th century hagiographical collections, the Jewish woman converts to Christianity. In these later, a more complex hierarchical discourse emerges. Griffin Afgard and Suriano, both from the 16th century, include a similar story in their travel narratives, but alter it in significant ways. A Christian family, not the Virgin herself, suggests that the imperial Jewish woman turned to an image of the Virgin Mary. Once a Jewish woman has safely given birth, she does not convert, but rather she throws the image out, saying, "Out, Mary, out." This detail differentiates the story both from its counterparts in European miracle collections like the Cantigas de Santa Maria of King Alfonso X, and from the stories in Christian pilgrimage narratives in which Muslims call upon the Virgin Mary for aid. In the Cantigas, the Virgin actively seeks out the Jewish woman and recruits her, indicating that the Virgin herself desired the Jewish woman to become one of her devotees. In Afgard and Suriano's account, Mary's aid comes through intermediaries, the Christian family who urges the woman and the image of Mary, rather than the personalized vision that we find in the Cantigas. These factors serve to distance the Jewish woman from Mary even before she casts Mary's image away. In Christian accounts of Muslim encounters with Mary, while the Muslims do not convert, they permanently revere Mary as a result of her intervention. In so doing, they simultaneously recognize the truth of the Christian saint and become part of her extended community with the Christians, albeit lesser members in these Christian texts. Afgard and Suriano tale of the Jewish woman in childbirth follows the trope of members of religious other compelled to venerate a particular saint. However, by casting away the image of Mary, as soon as the crisis is over, the Jewish woman rejects the possibility of being included in any expanded community of devotees. Suriano takes the story a step farther and generalizes so that all Jewish women in Venice must call upon the Virgin Mary in order to give birth. Thus, he creates a kind of permanent, unwilling Jewish cult of the Virgin Mary, in which Jews are continually calling upon and then repudiating Mary. The Jews are dependent on and subjugated to the Christian saint, but since they alone exclude themselves from the saint's community, they are at the very bottom of the religious hierarchy, much as they are in Fabry's treatment of Jews in relations to Muslims and Christians. So, what does it all mean? I would argue that for a kind of altered form of the Turner's original concept of communitas, in combination with some of the observations of Eden, Salino, Haydn, and Kadar, European Jews and Christians did imagine that holy people and participation in pilgrimage to their gravesite could create a broader community that undermined strict divisions between Jew and non-Jew, or Christian and non-Christian. Travel to a distant place, participation in ritual veneration, all facilitated this. Nevertheless, these examples also affirm the observations of subsequent authors and scholars, namely that holy places, people, and more rarely rituals held in common between multiple groups were also the focus of competing discourses. European Jews and Christians used the presence of the religious other in order to affirm their own religious worldview, which placed their own community at the top of a religious hierarchy. For both of them, Muslims occupied a kind of middle ground of belonging and otherness, desirable yet potential enemy, in need of disciplining. The European Jews and Christians traveling to Muslim-controlled lands had to come to terms with third party being socially and politically dominant over them, something that might have been less shocking to any coming from Iberia, where Muslims still ruled part of the region, but unaccustomed to any from other regions. I would suggest that Muslims, because of their political power and demonstrable ability to beat the Christians at war, were treated as the more desirable religious other. Their power gave greater prestige to the saint or tzaddik. European Jewish and Christian depictions of one another in the role of participant in revering a holy person or site reflected the relatively tenser relationships, both rhetorical and in real life, between Jews and Christians in various parts of Latin Europe. The religious hierarchies which European Jewish and Christian travelers to the Middle East in their narratives may also be interpreted as a kind of resistance to the challenge presented by Muslim power and success, even as these Jews and Christians sought to co-opt it rhetorically, and resistance to one another, as European Jews and Christians found themselves in a situation in which they were on an equal plane with one another as minorities under Muslim rule. And I think my time is about up, is it not?
No, sorry, you still have time, so
Okay.
it's fine.
But what did Muslims think of all this? Or for that matter, Jews and Christians of the Eastern Mediterranean lands? First of all, it should be noted that Muslim law and Jewish and Christian law from Islamicate lands address the issue of permissibility of giving charity and religious others, and that of receiving gifts and donations to religious places by religious outsiders. Charity to those outside the community was permitted, although there was some restrictions, particularly in the context of inheritance. We have a number of legal codes indicating the extent to which churches could accept donations from outsiders, particularly Muslims. More problematic were personal gifts, especially on the religious holidays of people outside one's own religious community. But accepting charity seems to have been tolerated. The point of this little legal excursus is that for some of the main markers of festivals and holy sites, namely gift giving or charity, the possibility that people outside of the community would participate in these was incorporated into Jewish, Christian, and Muslim law in Islamicate lands. This suggests first that such cross-religious giving was a fairly common part of life and interaction, and that the presence of these laws made certain kinds of cross-religious participation in ritual a little easier. Like their European counterparts, Christians and Jews living under Muslim rule in Egypt and the Levant also recorded the presence or participation of Muslims in either a neutral fashion or with pleasure. Similar patterns emerge. The presence and favorable recognition by Muslims, especially Muslim leaders, are a source of pleasure for Christian and Jewish authors alike, and both on occasion and regaled their readers with tales of Muslims being subject to divine punishment, when they treated holy places or people of a Christian or Jewish community with disrespect. For Christians living under Muslim rule, however, state support was particularly cherished. While the religious other of choice in Eastern Christian and Jewish sources remained Muslims, both Jews and Christians represented one another as important witnesses to the sanctity and truth of individuals or sites, although the degree of pleasure or hostility and compulsion involved varied from author to author. Late Jewish sources, Mamluk and Ottoman period, provide indications of Jews turning to Muslim holy figures and ritual specialists and cooperation as well as competition between these specialists and their Jewish counterparts. Indications of the same phenomenon between Jewish and Christian holy figures are less clear but suggestive. Christian authors seem to be especially enthusiastic when high-ranking Muslims attended and participated in Christian festivals and sought out Christian holy individuals or visited monasteries. This pattern suggests that many Christians in these regions sought to portray Muslim participation or endorsement as an affirmation of their own faith, much as Western Christians and Jews did. We find this in the Melkite Christian author Yahya bin Sa'id al-Antioch from the 11th century, who records the various prohibitions and persecutions on the part of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, including al-Hakim's rather inconsistent policies toward Christian festivals and Muslim attendance at them. For example, Ibn Sa'id notes that al-Hakim prohibited Christians and Muslims alike from carrying palm branches and participating in Palm Sunday processions, and during one Eid al-Khitas, Epiphany, or Eid al-Hamim, as it was called in this passage. And the Caliph forbade any mention of the holiday, let alone celebrating it, whereas in previous years, he had not only allowed it, but also observed the celebrations personally. In the same passage in which Sa'id describes these prohibitions, however, he also portrays the customs prior to the prohibition, stating, the cross was carried publicly. The governor, who would have been a Muslim, of the town rode on horseback with his cortege accompanying the Christians and defending them. The public display of the cross, the Muslims officials riding, presumably with the usual accoutrements such as saddles and decoration, with a whole group of his followers in such a way as to appear as part of the Christian procession itself. And finally, his protection of the Christians all emphasized dignity which dhimmis were not normally allowed, such as carrying religious symbols publicly. The passage also depicts this important Muslim and those under his employ not merely as defenders of the Christians, but seemingly as part of the Christian celebration and willing to violate the hierarchy of Muslim over Christian stipulated by Muslim law. Noting that the caliphs al-Hakim and al-Zahar themselves watched the Christian festival seemed to be a point of pride for this Christian chronicler. I would argue that the choice of what he recorded is significant, for his Christian readers would have well understood the honor implied by such behavior. For example, the same insinuation of Muslim belonging at which was hinted at the description of the local Muslim official in Palm Sunday celebrations discussed earlier is suggested more forcefully by Ibn Sa'id's portrayal of al-Hakim's relationship with Anbas Salmun in the monastery of Al-Qusair. Al-Hakim is depicted as associated with the monks, wearing woolen clothes like them, and being so accommodating to Anbas Salmun that Muslims accuse the caliph of having become al-Salmun's disciple. Indeed, Sa'id carefully describes how Hakim travels alone to the monastery beyond Al-Qusair, leaving his attendants behind. Such details give the impression that al-Hakim was going there on a personal spiritual quest, or at least doing something in the monastery which he did not want to share with his Muslim followers. The distinction between clothing of Muslims and non-Muslims, in particular between Muslim and Christian dress, was heavily emphasized in early versions of the Pact of Umar and in al-Hakim's own inconsistently enacted regulation. Thus, for al-Hakim himself, an infamous opponent of the dhimmis, to adopt the clothing, respect the holy places of Christians, and to bow to the will of a Christian monk to the point that even his fellow Muslims remark on it, becomes a testimony for the power of the Christian religion and the Christian holy man, namely Anbas Salmun. Many of the same themes appear in the volumes of the history of the Christian patriarchs of the Coptic Christian from the Crusading and Mamluk eras. Certain Muslim common folk and leaders of varying levels are depicted as seeking out churches and monasteries and honoring the Christian priests, abbots, or patriarchs whom they find, as well as the sacred space itself. Members of the Muslim regime go to monasteries seeking healing and advice, and in turn offer donations and privileges to the monastery and Christian holy man. Instances in which Muslims, and more rarely Jews, are noted as watching or participating in the consecration of a church or joining the procession for the appointment of an abbot or patriarch, suggests that the presence of the religious other at such occasions was to be understood as a special honor by Coptic and perhaps other Christian communities. In many ways, these later accounts parallel those of the 11th century Ibn Sa'id. A notable difference, however, is that Ibn Sa'id's account, the presence of the caliph's men on horseback added dignity to a Christian festival. In the later descriptions in the history of the patriarchs of Christian celebration under the rule of the Ayyubid Sultan, Al-Kamil, the Christians themselves are allowed this honor. In all examples, however, part of what contributed to that accolade was that the observers were not Christian. Nor does the Sultan have to be bullied by a member of the Holy Dead into granting such license, as in the contest between the Sultan and Rabbi Meir in the travelogue of Rabbi Pitaki of Regensburg. Instead, it is the willing accordance of such freedoms by a Muslim leader which is cause for celebration. The Christians in this narrative have more liberty and power than in other accounts of the triumph of religious minorities. They need no saintly intervention because Al-Kamil himself has become the focus of glorification for his sanctity and pious behavior. As such, he is both a powerful outsider who adds dignity to Christian sites and individuals precisely because of his status as leader of the Muslims, yet also as a devotee who recognizes the worthiness of the monks and patriarch. Stories of Muslim rulers visiting monasteries and monks need to be seen in the context of long-standing practices and literary tropes describing Muslim outings at monasteries. However, these accounts reflect more than mere rhetorical poi, for as we shall see, there is abundant evidence from Muslim authors of interest in such churches and monasteries. Okay, so since we're running out of time, let me go over quickly what remains. When we look at the travel accounts of Muslims, what we find is a description of Muslims attending churches and going to monasteries, but the reasons that they give are completely different. We find that we have lavish descriptions, particularly, for example, Ibn Battuta, who's quite famous Muslim traveler from the late Middle Ages, gives the descriptions of churches, tries to go in them. We have some who even attend celebrations such as Christmas in the churches. Nevertheless, the way they describe it is that they are going to admire the beauty and they're curious about what is going on, but there is no indication of any kind of religious reverence. So that what we find in Muslim narratives, for the most part, is kind of touristic interest rather than religious one. And we can see the contrast between how the Jews and Christians, both Eastern and Western, interpret what the Muslims are doing and what the Muslims actually think of themselves. That said, and I can read one, while most of the descriptions of that Muslims write themselves, who are travelers, are more touristic in their attitude, we do find a few examples of Muslims where they seem to be joining religious ceremonies of Christians and holy places for religious reasons. And let me see if I can find this for you. No. So I want to end with this last passage and share with you. We have the Muslim astronomer Al-Qazwini, so he's from the 13th century, and he recounts the following about a church in a village near Damascus. And here he says, it is a great church still in use, of fine construction, built on marble and pillars and ornamented with mosaics. It is called Al-Najran. Muslims and Christians make votive offerings to it. Tradition has it that votive offerings are tried and proven. A group travels throughout the lands on horseback to collect the votive offerings to it, crying aloud, "Who will make votive offerings to the Blessed Virgin?" The Blessed Najran, sorry. The Sultan has assigned a gift for it, which they convey every year. So this is one of the few examples we have of an unproblematized description of Muslims participating in a Christian ceremony. We do also have some from some of the Mamluk historians when they describe Nehruz. However, even those, what you often find is that they will describe it for Fatimids who are doing it. Now, Fatimids were Shia, and Mamluk historians are writing much later. And scholars have noted that Fatimids seem to have tried to use festivals in such a way as to encourage Sunni and Shia to come together, and also Jews and Christians under their rule. Mamluk, Ayyubid and Mamluk historians come back and use this policy by the Fatimids polemically to portray them as lax Muslim, whereas Mamluk rulers condemn such festivals. So here's a nice example of some of the phenomena that Haydn talks about, where it's really about how the past was represented, how the current politics work, so that we really have to think, when we read these kinds of descriptions, what it is that the author is trying to get across or really say, not only about the religious other, but also about the religious self, or sort of internecine squabbles that might exist. So I guess I will end here. I'm sorry I wasn't able to cover all of it, but as a point of interest, there is a whole body of Muslim literature that deals with what they call innovation, so opposition to shared practices, and describes them in great detail, which is useful for this, but also has its own kind of rhetoric. And the last thing that would be interesting, but is a bit too complicated to talk about here, is in so short a time, is instances of real compelled veneration, either by the Muslim authorities or particularly in Iberia, where you have Muslims and Jews who are forced into participating in Christian ceremonies. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting paper. A whole world that you are showing us, also from very different perspectives. That's really interesting in terms of lived neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. We have the opportunity to enter into a conversation with our speaker. As usual, you can use the yellow hand to indicate you have a question, or just write your question in the chat, or if I overlook you, just speak. So are there any questions at this point? Yes, please. Rebecca Voss.
Hi, Alex, nice to see you.
Hi.
You cannot see me, but that was a great talk. Thank you very much. I have two questions. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you also have examples about sites which are taken over by one group. Let's say
a lot of them, actually.
It used to be a shared site, and then for some reason, either one side is pushed out, one religious group, and the other takes over, or one side gives up a specific ritual, and then it's taken over by the other one. It's also sort of something like maybe which we could call like killing of the source, that that one interpretation proves more valid over the centuries. That's one point. And the other one, you brought this interesting quote from Petachia about the, which I assume is the grave of Meir Baal HaNes in Syria. And I was wondering, do you have later sources, also from the early modern period, when the Jewish pilgrimage to this site in Tiberias picks up? Do you also have other instances?
I would have to look. I originally didn't intend to go much beyond the 16th century, though I have some 17th century sources. I would have to see if they mention that. I don't think any of them were quite as, if there are, they're probably not as colorful. Pataki of Regensburg, I would have noticed them, but I can look for you if you like. As for the sites that are taken over, and that is a big part of it, it's also, you have things that are completely taken over and turned into a mosque or a church. Then you also, for the Middle East, what you have is the question of who controls it. So, for example, Mary's tomb or some of the shrines to Mary, and for example, the Ezekiel's tomb. You have Muslims who control it, and you have these descriptions by Jewish and Christian travelers how to get around it. I mean, Hebron is the same way because it's controlled by them, though the Muslims also recognize that it's a place of Christian or Jewish pilgrimage. They allow it, but then they charge them money. And so some of it is about how do you get out of paying a tax, or describing the saint as beating up the Muslim guard for charging the Jewish or Christian pilgrims too much money. So it's kind of an intermediate in that sense.
Thanks.
Okay, I see a question that was written in the chat by Rosa Reicher. I don't know whether you can see it. Can Benjamin Kedau's concept of convergence be compared with John Locke's understanding of tolerance? That's the question. Does Locke's definition of tolerance allow such a fine distinction into three categories?
Well, the person who really used John Locke was actually Haydn. Haydn makes the point, I mean, he engages directly with John Locke's concept of tolerance, and he argues that John Locke's idea was that tolerance is not about embracing a group, but putting up with, enduring the fact that they are there and they conduct these kinds of behaviors, which I guess does go a little bit with his idea of convergence, where whoever has power allows for the existence of these other kinds of festivals or other religious groups. I didn't see that Locke's ideas could break down into three separate groups, but maybe I need to read John Locke again a little bit more carefully. But I see Kedar's categories in some ways as more paralleling or being a response to the Turner's ideas of different kinds of communitas, and sort of argue, in some ways, kind of arguing against that or trying to refine that in some way. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope so.
If I can continue, I have a question. You mentioned, and I found that very interesting, this degree of enthusiasm Christians felt about Muslim participation in holy sites. And I understood that this is because they appreciate this implicit affirmation of legitimacy of the Christian religion or the Christian presence in that area. I was wondering whether there is also an element of ambivalence here on the Christian perception. Is there no fear, no concern of being exposed to Muslim piety or of a distortion of the own ritual by the Muslim participation in that, or the imposition of narratives from a Muslim point of view?
Yeah. We have a lot more of that from the Muslim perspective. So the Muslim religious authorities, there is a whole group of them who are very anxious about precisely this, namely that Muslims are going to Christian and sometimes even Jewish celebrations or imitating them. Sometimes you don't even have to do something together with them. It's just if you are celebrating your holiday in a way that looks the same as the celebrations of the Jews or Christians, this is seen as problematic. And as bad as if you went and you participated in a synagogue service or something. On the Christian side, we do have a few texts like that. They're not as extensive as the Muslim ones, but what they're concerned with is not so much about Muslims coming to them as Christians going and imitating Muslims. However, I would also say that some of these stories about Muslims coming and being disrespectful or what have you, in a way is also addressing that problem, so that at least from a narrative perspective, it doesn't really help you on a practical level. But when you could tell stories about how Muslims are beaten up for disrespecting the Eucharist or an icon or a church, it's saying that, you know, yes, Muslims can be here, but they have to behave in a Christian way at some level. And we find the same kind, I mean, I left out my section on Eastern Jews. We find the same kind of attitude with them. And also the same kind of pattern where Muslims are still the preferred religious other. They deal with Christians. They don't like them as much, but on the other hand, they're not as hostile toward them as European Jewish writers. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Are there any further questions? Otherwise, I can just continue because I'm really interested in the gender element of your talk.
Sure.
Because I mean, the example of the Virgin Mary is so prominent as one dimension of what you said, and I was wondering about the motivation of Muslim or Jewish participants in these kind of rituals, and also in the question whether. I mean, there seems to be long continuity of that. If you look at Jerusalem today, I have colleagues there, especially colleague Nurit Stadler, who works on sites in Jerusalem devoted to the Virgin Mary, where there's still this phenomenon. So is a gendered perspective here?
Well, what you find particularly with the Virgin Mary is that descriptions are very often of women in particular going to them. There's a lovely passage in Suriano where he describes how a group of Muslim women said, "You don't deserve to venerate her, you're just not good enough." And there are descriptions of going for reasons of fertility or trouble giving birth and so forth. However, one of the things I wrote, I didn't talk about it here because I published on this, but one of the things I discovered when I was looking at these kinds of texts from a gendered perspective is, at least from the Muslim end of things, they use gender polemically. So very often it's women who are the ones who are described as doing these behaviors, and the men are criticized for following their women rather than, you know, keeping in control of them. And you get if you read the descriptions, as I said, the kinds of legal texts in Islam are very, very detailed, which make them wonderful to use. But if you read them superficially, you get the impression that, yeah, it's all the women's fault, or mainly it's women doing that. And when I first started this research, I was looking for women's religion, or if there was such a thing. But then if you read them more carefully, you realize that men are also doing it, but they always emphasize women's participation more. So it becomes the gender description, you have to be careful because it's a way of shaming men, saying you're behaving like women and you shouldn't do that. With the Jewish material, it's actually kind of interesting. They don't seem to do that too much. Rather the opposite. What they do is they describe women's practices, but then they also describe, in a few instances, how women can have greater access to the holy spaces, because if they dress as Muslims, no one can tell because they're all covered. And they talk about how Jewish women have greater access, for example, to Hebron or something like that.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So we're looking at the list of participants. Are there any further questions? So would have a little bit of time, but you don't have to use it, of course. Yes, Antonia Steins, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I was wondering, because in the beginning you talked about the festival as sort of an extraordinary circumstance, and we've heard several speakers who talked about the relationship between the everyday and the extraordinary. And I was wondering, in these texts, how is the participation of the other framed? Is it an extraordinary circumstance that belongs within the festival context, or is the focus more on the everyday relationship with the other group? What would you say?
I would say that it's usually framed as something that is extraordinary. So Jewish, Christian, even Muslim authors make whether they like it or not, describe these kinds of shared participation or the behavior of festival as something unusual, out of the ordinary, something to either be celebrated or something is terrible that they have to get in control of. One of the places you do see this kind of behavior as portrayed as something more normal or everyday is actually some of the few texts we have from the Cairo-Geniza, where it's mentioned casually that they gave a Muslim charity or that they invited their Muslim friends to a Purim celebration. And it's not there. It seems to be more about the daily interaction. And they're just describing what happened to them or what they did that day, rather than creating this whole narrative and so forth. But that has to do with the type of sources that are being used too. So the Cairo-Geniza often tends to be letters to individuals, or sometimes their responses, so asking about a legal problem. Whereas the Muslim legal texts against sharing or these travel narratives, they're writing for an audience and they have an agenda, and a very clear agenda, a broader agenda or a broader audience they want to address, I think. I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I have maybe one final question about your findings, and that is more theoretical. It's about the question of the entanglement of the three communities in that area and at that time.
Mm-hmm.
From your sources, would you say that there is an entanglement in the following regard, that the perception of the other changes by participating in the other's rituals or holy sites, or is that just a matter of living together and a social aspect? Does it change the self-perception, or is there no element of mutual influence, demarcation?
Well, there's certainly demarcation. I mean, the travelers from Europe certainly seem surprised. I mean, sometimes it's a little hard to distinguish rhetoric from reality in these texts, but they seem genuinely surprised to find that Muslims or Jews are doing this. Though, as I said, they rarely actually talk about Jews. And that's not pretty. But there they seem to be somewhat surprised. The Jewish writers don't seem surprised so much as just really happy about it. I think in terms of entanglement, one of the things there are a few things to keep in mind. One is that travel narratives, like Christians read other Christian travel narratives. So sometimes we can really see that certain ones influenced others or what have you. I'm not doing a careful sort of source study where I map that out. But it's clear that there is an entanglement in that regard, and also even from oral reports as well. So they talk about things that they have heard. We find this in Jewish sources as well. One of the things I think has been underestimated in a way is the level of communication between Jews in the Middle East and Jews in Europe for this kind of thing. I mean, we have in other kinds of circumstances plenty of evidence that there was communication between these two regions, and they swapped poems, they swapped literature, they certainly sold goods and traveled. So that, for example, I think sometimes there's been a tendency to see them as separate, but I came to realize as I was working on this book that one had to realize that, for example, the Jews in Europe and Jews in Muslim land had the same concepts about death, the smell, all of those kinds of things, so that they would have felt at home with this material, but that they also heard stories about what happened in these other places and traveled there and so forth. So I think they're very entangled in that way. Another place where you have a lot of entanglement, and I had not realized until I started working on this, you have a large number of immigrants, or at least a noticeable number of immigrants from Al-Andalus and the Maghreb into Egypt, so that it changes the Muslim land sort of legal landscape, so that Maliki law becomes more, which is very strict against these kinds of practices, becomes better known and starts influencing some of the other Muslim law. And some of the texts that come from Egypt, you realize they're actually Muslim authors who've moved from the Al-Andalus and the Maghreb into Egypt. And you think about this, we also have this a little bit among the Jews. The most notable example that everyone would know would be Maimonides. We don't have as many very, shall we say, loud examples from the Maghreb and Al-Andalus among the Jewish population, but it's clear that you have people coming because they talk about them coming or taking up posts as teachers and so forth. So there you have a really strong entanglement as well.
Great, thank you. This is really fascinating research, and we really hope to see the book in the near future and read more in detail what you found out. Thank you so very much for a very interesting talk and for spending the evening with us. Thank you to the audience. And this is just for the audience of students. I sent you an email this morning, so I will be in my Zoom room. I sent you the link if you have the desire to talk about the series briefly and also about exams. Just dial into my Zoom room at 7:45, and I will be there. We can discuss things. Thank you, Alexandra Cuffel, for this evening, and all the best.
All right.
Usually I would invite you for dinner.
Well, perhaps another time when COVID is all over.
Yes.
Thank you.
So all the best. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.